Is there a truly reality out there that humans can really know? It's an age-old battle between realists and absolutists. God is not great, how religion ruins everything. And yet it's utterly and totally ridiculous. We need to live for something beyond ourselves. Imagine entering a massive library. Walls of hardback and paperbacks just cover the walls. You look at all these books, and maybe if you're like me, you'd stand in awe of all that knowledge. But suppose though, all those volumes dealt with arguments for a flat Earth. Or suppose all those books were about UFO kidnappings. People claim they were kidnapped by little green men and UFOs and experimented on and brought back. Or suppose all the books dealt with Chinese astrology, or books that were written by people who deny the Holocaust ever happened. How much awe would you feel then? But maybe the books had references. Wow, they had references. Some people make a big deal, references. But what are references? References are just people quoting other people who are often quoting other people, and on and on and on. So what does that prove? It proves only that people who wrote the books know a lot about what other people are saying about whatever topic they're talking about. But it doesn't prove that there's any real knowledge except the knowledge of what other people are saying about things. Now, you might be an expert in, say, Greek and Roman mythology. You might know all there is to know about Greek and Roman mythology, but does that give you any knowledge about what real truth is other than ancient Greek and Roman mythology? You might know all there is to know about Romulus and Remus, but what does that truth teach you really about the founding of Rome itself? You might, if a Holocaust denial book was filled with references to other Holocaust deniers, what do we learn other than what other Holocaust deniers are saying? How much knowledge, real knowledge, is gained through that? See, knowledge comes in kind of a circularity. As more books are written, the circle gets wider and wider, but it still goes round and round. And so often it's simply more human beings simply quoting more human beings. Suppose though those books were science books. We're not talking about deconstructionist critique of the writings of the Marquis de Sade or something. We're talking instead about atoms, about gluons, about protons, about the continental shells. We're talking about reality itself. Doesn't that break us out of this circle? Isn't that real knowledge? Well, not quite. Science is inevitably out of necessity. It's still a human endeavor, shackled and weighed down and distorted by all the shackles, weights, and distortions that inevitably follow all human knowledge. Scientists are people, and sometimes they have a very real political or social agenda in their work. I mean, where do you think nuclear energy came from? It was one group of scientists trying to work faster than another group of scientists to create the atomic bomb so one side could drop the bomb quicker on the other side, or drop it before the other side dropped it on them. In other words, there were all sorts of political, in this case, military considerations that were involved here. Now, the point about this is there's this idea, this myth out there that science stands at some kind of Archimedean point, some point outside of all the subjectiveness of humanity. And it's really not true. Science is in many ways, it's a historical enterprise. It unfolds in time and history. And it's impacted by what's here and what's now. Scientific concepts, scientific theories, and scientific assumptions are all bound up with the culture, history, and language because scientists themselves are bound up with all those things. And whatever they experience or whatever they think they experience, it comes filtered through all that filters human knowledge. I mean, you think Darwinian evolution arose in a moral or philosophical vacuum? On the contrary. Or do you think people tenaciously cling to it today because it's absolute truth and they're not influenced by cultural or political considerations? Please don't be naive. But see, the question that you ask is then, what assumptions drive any scientific endeavor? What books are assumptions based on? What purpose? You know, if you think about it for a minute, you think about how different science is today than it was 100 years ago. It's changed. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm only saying that these changes should keep us from being too dogmatic about what science says. 100 years ago, who ever heard of the idea of curved space? Now it's a foundational part of cosmology. 100 years ago, who ever heard of quantum theory? Well, today quantum theory is foundational to almost all physics and science. More than 100, who ever heard of the DNA double helix? Who ever heard of string theory or quarks? Not more than 100 years ago, some scientists even questioned if atoms existed. Some of the most progressive and basically and firmly established scientific views of reality, things that were just assumed to be immutable, things that were assumed to be foundational, these were eventually kicked out and nobody believes them anymore. So the question is, who knows what scientific theories of today, deemed utterly certain, deemed utterly solid, the things that are absolutely immovable, who knows that they might be gone tomorrow? It's very possible. People have spent their lives working on scientific concepts that a generation or two later were proved totally wrong. Again, what this tells us is that we need to be careful when someone says, well, science proves it. You know, that means we ought to automatically accept it. Now, I'm not getting into some of this wacky, radical social reconstruction and feminist theory, the kind of people who they claim that E equals MC squared is a sexist equation because it prefers one rate of speed over another, or this kind of nonsense one philosopher called Newton's Principia a rate manual or whatever. I don't want to get into that nonsense. There's no question that science does tap into something that's out there, that's real, as opposed to something we made up. It's, you know, it's kind of like the difference between, say, particle physics and film theory. But here's the point. The problem is that assumptions change, and what scientists think change along with them. The scientific realities of even a generation or two ago are not the same as today. And I have no doubt that if time should last, some of these ex cathedra scientific pronouncements, scientific certainties that we're absolutely sure of will one day be mocked as myth. But thus we must never forget that in the end what science reveals always remains uncertain, particular, and contingent, as opposed to necessary, absolute, and universal, because human knowledge remains that way. So there's no question, no matter how large the library, no matter how many impressive volumes fill the shelves, no matter how large the circle gets, it still of necessity tends to just go around and around